So, A Fine-Looking Soldier is the story of a woman who dresses as a man to enlist in the Union Army, only to fall in infuriatingly infatuation with her bunkmate, who is very suspicious of her and knows she's up to something. I am going to read from kind of the latter half of this book. So, our main characters are Henry Schaefer and Charley Smith. Charley Smith is her alias name, and her kind of birth name is Cate Ellis. And so she has disguised herself and is, in basic training at Fort Snelling here in Minnesota with Henry. And he has learned that she is a woman at this point in the story, and he's really trying to keep his pronouns straight in the scene in order to protect her secret. But he also maybe has a teeny tiny, really big crush on her at this point. So I will get started. They went through the motions of marching, each company parading before Colonel Van Cleve in turn, the commissioned officers eager to demonstrate their efforts to learn, then teach their men the school of the soldier. The companies generally did well marching as one, as they'd had occasion to practice that already, but they struggled when two companies were moving to occupy the same space. Several collisions occurred, which seemed so absurd to Henry because they did not move fast and there was plenty of time for the groups to stop before they collided. But the power of orders they had trained to obey these past 4 months, combined with a confusion about who should make a decision about what and when, caused many a squad to march haphazardly into each other. After about an hour of this, Captain Noah did the mercy of disbanding them for dinner. Henry sat next to Smith on the bench as he shoved food into his mouth. He nudged his elbow against hers. She didn't flinch away, and in fact, applied pressure back. Henry grinned into his tin plate and then looked up to track the conversation at the table. Kruger was across from him and lifted an eyebrow. Henry twitched his arm away and glared back. Henry had no intention of letting him pick away at him, making insinuating comments about the Turners, but it reminded him that he should do well to keep his infatuation with Smith hidden. No one else knew that he was secretly a woman. "Fellas, I've got exciting news," Elias exclaimed as he eagerly slammed his plate down and wedged himself in between Kruger and Jacob. "We just got a big load of uniforms from the Federals." Henry sat up straight in his seat, almost in unison with the rest of the squad. "Yes!" Williamson exclaimed in a characteristic squeal. "Did they get the caps, too?" Jacob asked. "I want a good CDV of me and the whole get-up for Mary before we leave." Elias nodded. "Yes, forage caps and everything, even the knapsacks and the water canteens. You guys, bayonet scabbards, the whole kit and caboodle." The excitement across the table was palpable. Henry shoveled the last of the bland stew into his maw as word spread up and down the tables. As soon as they were through, the squad hustled out to the parade ground, lurking outside the door of the quartermaster in hopes of being the first to get their uniform. Sergeant Osborne found them there, towards the head of a mob that had turned into a haphazard queue, and regarded Elias with a long-suffering sigh. "So, I take it you told them about the delivery." Elias grinned. "Well, I suppose I don't have any orders to give, as you're already doing what I was going to tell you to do." And with a shrug, he joined their group. After a few moments, the quartermaster opened the door and began shuffling soldiers through, taking a rough measure and distributing the many sundry items of their new uniforms. With their goods piled into their arms, the entire squad hustled out of the fort and across the parade ground to their tents. Henry was the first back to his tent, Smith close on his heels. It had begun to rain again, a cold drizzle that cut to the bone. He crawled in first, dumping the pile of brand-new clothes onto his gum blanket, and seating himself cross-legged to take stock of all he had received. Smith crawled in behind him and tied the tent flaps together. Henry eagerly spread the blue wool coat out in front of him. Brass buttons embossed with the seal of the United States marched down the front, and a bit of piping lined the collar and cuffs. Blue trousers made of the same fabric were folded neatly along with it, a forage cap on top. Henry grinned, shrugged his coat off, and shoved his arms through the sleeves of his new uniform. When he looked up, he caught a flash of Charley's eyes on him as she hung that blanket from the center pole. He didn't really know what he'd expected, but whatever it was, the hanging divider was a disappointment in comparison. There was shuffling as she tried to maneuver in the cramped space she had made for herself. He thought he might try to convince her that it wasn't necessary, but he hesitated, not wanting her to think him eager to take advantage of the situation. He knew he was trustworthy not to observe too closely, but she was not privy to his thoughts, and might have a number of preconceived notions about what a man might do in a tent with a half-dressed lady. The gray blanket certainly did little to help him forget that that was precisely what was happening. So he did the only thing he could think of to do. He talked about the weather. "It sure will be nice to have these greatcoats now that the frost has come," he said. "This rain has been awful." "It'll help when we head for the front," Smith responded. "I understand they scarcely ever get snow in Virginia." "That'll be a relief. These winters are hell froze over," Henry complained, unbuttoning his suspenders and wiggling out of his wool trousers to swap them for his new blue ones. The air was biting cold, making the hairs on his legs stand up. He kicked the trousers off his ankles urgently so he could pull his new ones on as quick as possible, but trying to get them off over his boots was more trouble than it was worth. Meanwhile, his balls were trying to retreat clear into his body to escape the cold. It was lucky they were headed to the front, because he had not thought to bring his flannel drawers. "Last winter, I heard there were folks up near St. Cloud who froze to death because they went out in a blizzard to milk a cow, and the snow was coming down so thick they got lost on their way back from the barn," Charley said, slightly muffled. Henry leaned down to pull at his trouser ankles, contorting under the slope of canvas. Now that he was halfway through without removing his boots, there was no reason to double back and start over. It was just the cuff of the trousers, probably caught on the boot sole. As he scrabbled, his heel caught at the blanket in the middle of the tent and pulled it taut. It held for a breathless moment before the edges tucked around the center pole slid loose, and the blanket crumpled, with scarcely a rustle, to the ground. Henry froze guiltily and stared at what the rough felted wool had been hiding from view. Charley was buttoning up her stays over a clean white shirt, tightly woven enough that he couldn't really see the curve of her breast, but thin enough that he could see the shadow of her nipples. And there he was, with his pants caught around his ankles, the drape of his own shirt doing very little to hide his immediate interest. It was cold, but his face was burning with embarrassment. He didn't usually wear drawers, but for the first time, he felt strongly that he might start. Charley hadn't noticed yet. She had her chin tucked to one shoulder, buttoning a shoulder strap in place, her dark curls falling over her brow. Henry thought to reach out and try to replace the blanket, but he was terrified that if he moved, she would look up and see that he had a hard one, and Smith's disdainful glare would narrow her eyes and he would be humiliated. So he remained frozen, his knees up and his shirt tucked between his bare legs. His mouth was so dry he thought his tongue might get stuck to the roof of his mouth. She must have sensed something was wrong, because she looked up and regarded him with her wide, dark eyes, for a moment that felt like a goddamn eternity. Her expression hardened, and she opened her mouth as though to tell him off, but right at that moment, they both heard a voice just outside their tent. "Hello there, Corporal. Very fine coat you have there." It was Jacob's laughing tenor. "Why, thank you, I just had it done up," Elias replied. Charley shut her mouth, but her eyes were livid as she pulled her stays tight around herself and fumbled with the buttons. Henry winced and mouthed. Her eyes darted down at the blanket and then back up at him. Her eyebrows lifted expectantly. Henry reached forward as best he could and snatched one corner of the blanket, dragging it towards him. He tried to tuck it into the center pole, but it pulled itself back down by its own weight. With his ankles hog-tied by his trousers and his thighs pressed tight together for modesty's sake, he couldn't manage much more than that. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Smith hissed. "I'm stuck," Henry hissed back. Smith sneered at him and quickly finished fastening the buttons on the stays, then reached behind and pulled the laces snug. His warm and cozy bedfellow was nowhere to be found in Smith's flashing eyes. Henry reached down and resolutely tugged on his pant legs, freeing his ankles. He quickly shuffled to pull his new blue trousers on, yanking the itchy new wool over his boots and up over his bare knees. Smith, for his part, had slung his new coat onto his shoulders and was fastening up the brass buttons with clumsy fingers, trying his best to look everywhere except at Henry. Despite his scowl, his cheeks were pink. "Really, I should get the name of your tailor," Jacob said to Elias, still just outside. The two of them laughed. Smith glowered in their general direction, rolling his eyes. Henry struggled with his trousers, trying to get them up over his hips without compromising his own privacy. "Could you get that blanket hung again?" Henry murmured, as he rocked the waistband higher while still trying to keep his knees blocking his more vulnerable places. Smith glared at him and crossed his arms. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want privacy?" Henry felt a strong flush come into his cheeks. "Come on, it was an accident. Tit for tat, Schaefer. Put your pants on." Charley Smith looked down her nose at him and pursed her lips in a way that seriously reminded him of his primary school teacher in Cincinnati. Unfortunately, it did nothing to toss ice on his erection. She wanted to watch him. Or mock him? It was unclear whether he was dealing with Charley or Smith. Henry took a shuddering inhale and tried his best to shimmy the waistband of his trousers up over his thighs. Hunching over to hide his tented shirt tails, he stuffed the ends of them into his trousers. Shifting from side to side, he tried to get them on the rest of the way, but he couldn't get them up over his butt. A glance up at Charley showed her trying hard to hide a smirk. She watched him unabashedly. Henry shook his head and sighed. Then he tossed himself back and lifted up his hips, shoving his traitor horn into the trousers with one hand as he pulled them up with the other. He fastened the buttonfly and his suspenders, blushing furiously, and glared at Charley. "Happy now?" he asked as he made for the front flap. Charley wasn't even trying to hide her secret little smile anymore. "Mm-hmm," she murmured, her eyes glittering with amusement as she gazed down at his waist. He waited for her to crawl out of the tent. She regarded him for a moment with that enigmatic smile before she said, "After you." Henry's brows furrowed. He felt like he was being tricked, but he couldn't put his finger on why. He gave an exasperated sigh and flung the tent flaps aside, crawling out into the freezing drizzle. That didn't cool him off, nothing would. Luckily, it looked like the rest of their squad had already set off for afternoon drills. As he stood, he felt a swat on his backside that made him jump a mile high, letting out a startled yelp. Behind him, Smith quit the tent and stood placidly. "You forgot your cap." Henry glared and snatched it from him, pulling it down firmly on his head. Smith laughed and loped off ahead, Henry jogging half-heartedly behind him, thoroughly confused. He couldn't decide if Smith was laughing at him or if Charley was laughing with him. This two personas business was becoming more effort than it was worth.
Wow. That was such a fun scene. I loved a lot about it, especially how all of the soldiers are just such young men being buffoons together.
Yeah, there's a lot of ding-dongs in this book.
I love it. Well, I have a lot of questions for you, but first we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors.